Enjoy this cool and short listicle provided by Dr. Arthur Versluis from his book Magic and Mysticism, based on philosopher Hans Jonas's existentialist depiction of Gnosticism. Here it is. 1. A hostile cosmos, Gnostic antipathy to nature. 2. A demiurge, or ignorant creator responsible for botched creation and hostile to human spiritual awakening. 3. Dualism, opposition between the realm of light and the realm of matter. 4. An elaborate mythology. 5. Myths concerning Sophia, wisdom, and her fall and restoration. 6. Belief in a hidden god, not the demiurge. 7. Difficulty of spiritual progress due to the archons or other hostile powers in the cosmos. Ignorance of the inherent fallen human condition. 8. Existence of the Ogdoad, or 8 spheres, including 7 planetary spheres, and possibility of their transcendence. 9. The necessity of gnosis, or direct spiritual knowledge from the realm of light. 10. A revealer or redeemer figure to show the way to the realm of light.
Valentinus believed the world we live in was created by a cruel god, and slightly stupid. A god that will send you plagues, or requires sacrifices, or destroys Babylon.
He wasn't wrong about that. The bastard had a mean temper.
Humans can escape this world, and return to the real one. The kingdom. And for that, you needed to achieve the gnosis, which could be described as true knowledge.
Welcome everybody to Aeon Byte, specifically AB Live. I am Miguel Connor, your host, your pompatus of Gnosis, and glad to see everybody on this Friday. We have a very special show. I hope you enjoyed this little intro. In fact, our guest once asked at a conference, are we still living in a Hans Jonas world? And I'd say we kind of still are in some way or another, and that is April DeConick. April, thank you very much for coming.
Glad to be here.
Always awesome to see you. And with us too, we've got the Moondog. Vance, how are you doing?
I'm fine and looking forward to the dispelling of the fallacy, the no true Gnostic or no true Christian.
Except for me. No, just kidding.
Yeah, me too.
I have the Gnosis, and it's $19.99 a month if you want that Gnosis.
That's right.
But awesome. And I see already people in the chat room. As always, if you have a question for April, this is your chance. Please super chat them so we can separate them and get to thee. And I think you should have questions because April released her book, Comparing Christianities, an Introduction to Early Christianity. I read it and it was amazing, and I will be rereading it and getting data and insights and scholarship for years to come, just as I did with the Gnostic New Age. So I didn't think April could top the Gnostic New Age, but she did, because this is the theory of everything. It's not just the history of Christianity and Gnosticism and all our favorite characters and villains, from Irenaeus to Polycarp to Valentinus to Basilides. Everything is there. So thank you for making it happen. Was this a hard book to create, or tell us about writing it? Because
it was really, when I took the project on, I didn't think it was going to be so hard. I thought, oh yeah, I know these folks. This should be okay to write. Could do it in 2 or 3 years. And I restarted the book 3 times. And by restart, I don't mean just like having written one chapter. I mean having written 4 or 5 chapters, and just had to scrap it and start over. So yeah, it was really a book that took about 7 years to write from the time that I, first started the project.
No, I can pour so much into it.
Yeah, and part of the issue for me was how do you tell the Christian story, the early Christian story, and include all the literature that's hasn't really been included in that story before, except as sort of like a side reference to, and oh, by the way, this is the material of the heretics. So like, how did I integrate all of that into a new Christian narrative? That was my difficulty.
Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed. And it shouldn't even be this way, right? Because I mean, in ancient times, Irenaeus and Justin Martyr, I'm sure they had sleepless nights worrying about Marcion and Valentinus. They were on their radar. They were part of the conversation.
Yes. Yes.
It wasn't something they just went to, on Sunday and like, oh, these Gnostics are causing problems or something.
Right. Right. Yes, there was a lot of interaction and engagement. And really, I mean, I learned a lot by writing this book, because I guess I just didn't realize how so many of these figures were all in Rome at the same time. And I mean, that world would have been a small world at that time. They all had to know each other. They all had to be talking to each other, sharing their ideas, arguing with each other, and so forth. So.
Oh, indeed, indeed. And yeah, as you write, this is probably the first attempt to write a comprehensive history of the first Christians in a pluralistic movement. So I guess the main question that would ask you is, how did Christianity start? And I think, I mean, before, you've got David Bracken. He talks about the three theories that we know, right? That we have the official propaganda, the apostles, and they spread the word. Then you have the sort of, it goes out in the Gnostics, and Marcions kind of branch out in the 2nd century. And the other one is the horse race theory, that all these groups, like, as soon as Jesus was crucified, they're running towards the Roman emperor to like, hey, we're the best, and we're the only one. But other scholars like David Litt was saying, we can't talk about Christianity in the 1st century. It's something we have to talk about the 2nd century. Yeah. What stance do you take?
Yeah, so that was one of the issues that I had with rewriting the book so many times, is that I was wanting to write some sort of linear narrative that, again, went like from Jesus, onward to Nicaea. And it's just impossible to do, because the evidence just doesn't support that linear narrative. And when we realized that linear narrative actually was created by the early Catholics to talk about their own history and to give that history legitimacy, then we just see that, that's just one story. And as a historian, I have to deal with evidence that I know for sure first. And I know for sure Paul's letters. So that kind of gives me a glimpse of what Christianity is in around 50, the kind of arguments and things that were going on. And then about 150, I start getting information like that's historical information, that I can place a person, that I can place a text, and that kind of thing. And so I had to really start in 150. And I had to talk about what was going on in 150 in the historical record, and then kind of go forward from there. And then after I was able to lay out what Christianity looked like in those few generations there, up to, like, say, Origen, that might help us to understand that kind of dead period that we know so little about in terms of historical record, which would be from Paul to about 150. So about 100 years of kind of shadowy, murky historical knowledge that scholars have filled in with stuff, but, like, are we filling that in correctly?
Yeah, and also, I mean, isn't it the issue that people like Paul and the first followers of Jesus, they wouldn't have seen themselves as, there was no Christianity. They were followers of Jesus in a very fluid and fragmented Jewish religions, Egyptian, Samaritan, it was very different than we think. They didn't just walk out and say, we are Christians.
Right. Yeah, and I struggled with that language in the textbook. And so I did give some explanation there. There is really no Christianity until the 2nd century, as we would think of a religion that was starting to distinguish itself from Judaism. Okay. Prior to that, Christianity was just a Jewish sectarian movement. Think of it as a Jewish messianic movement of the first century. Jesus was their Messiah. And according to Paul in his letters, the Christians were of various opinions. So this new Jewish sectarian movement on how to bring Gentiles into the fold, how to bring them into the people of Israel. And you have kind of maximalist folks who are saying, you got to follow all the rules of the Jewish scripture, of the Torah. You have ones that were kind of in the middle on it. Well, there's some things the Gentiles have to do, but they don't have to do everything. And then there were people like Paul that said, Gentiles don't have to do anything, that once the Spirit of God infuses them through baptism, they're part of the people of Israel, and that's that. So those three those kind of think of as opinions and groupings, I think is where we can trace the plurality of Christianity to.
Oh, for sure. In fact, I do have some visuals for those watching on video here and in Rockfin and other places. So I got Comparing Christianities by April DeConick. And so people will go back to this, but so people could see, here are the categories, like you said, the minimalists, followers who thought it was not necessary to burden the Gentiles with observing the law, maximalists, followers who demanded circumcision and follow the law, and moderates who are kind of in between. You don't have to maybe not get circumcised, but come on, just follow some of the Hebrew Bible, right? So those three were three important trajectories, if you will.
Right.
And then, of course, for the audience, again, great book, there's a lot of great charts. Everything is charted with the arrows, so you can see for yourself and do your own visual or to understand how these things moderated. And the other one that's great, if you want to talk about this or anything else, but that is, you take the approach of a family resemblance, and you've got Xenotheists, Transtheists, and Yahwists. Could you tell the audience a little bit about these three groups?
Sure. So the other thing that seems to really be playing as a factor within this Jewish sectarian movement is these different Christians reading the Genesis story, and or reading the Jewish scriptures more broadly. And so their interpretation of these texts had a wide range, or a difference of opinion on what these texts meant. You have, and they kind of, that what ends up happening is that these reads and start to form, if you will, social groups of interpreters, like interpretation. So you have Marcion, who's reading the Jewish scripture, and he's reading what he has, the Evangelion, the gospel, and the 10 letters of Paul he has, comparing them. And he determines that Jesus spoke of a new God who was a hidden God that nobody knew about before, that's from another world altogether, didn't create our world, isn't the Yahweh of the Genesis story. He understands that to be the Jewish God. And he forms a church around this theology. And I call them Xenotheists. These were people who believed in an alien God. And then the Transtheists are your folks who are reading the Genesis story, again, more along Platonic lines or middle Platonic lines, and understanding the demiurge there to be Yahweh, and that there is a transcendent God that is also kind of the initiator of our universe. I mean, he's the initiator of life and all the divine beings. And so this would be the Transtheists. And these folks, they have all different reads of the Genesis story. They're forming lots of multiple little social groups, as you have listed here. And like Valentinus would be in here as well. Right. And then you have the Yahwists, and these are the folks who read the Genesis story more along the lines of the way it's read traditionally in Judaism, with the Yahweh God being the creator of the universe, and he's the sole God, and he's the one that they're worshiping. So, and that's really where you're getting the Apostolic Catholics, you're getting the Ebionites from there, a lot of the Thomas Christians are there, and so forth.
So Marcion didn't believe in the transcendent God or the God above God, or he just thought that our God was an alien, or
So he
no?
believes in a transcendent entity, but that transcendence is so total, it's a God from another universe. So that God, so he didn't start at life here.
Yeah, I think what separates him, as I understand, is, for example, with the Gnostics, there's a transcendent God, but we have the divine spark. We have something from
Right.
him. We
Right.
share this essence. With Marcion, we are worms.
Ah,
We are, and this God will kind of come and by grace say, "Hey, you want to live?
Right.
Come with me if you want to live," like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah, and I
Then
think
he'll drop you. He'll drop the divine spark in your
I see.
soul.
no, he doesn't do that. It's actually resurrection. So when you
Okay.
die, he takes your soul because he's ransomed it. He's bought it from the devil, or not the devil. I'm sorry. He's bought it from the Jewish God, and he then transforms you into a spiritual being. So he's reading Paul there, right? I mean, that's how he's interpreting Paul in 1 Corinthians 15.
Exactly.
Thanks.
So and you say that's really the first time in history we have this concept.
Yeah, I mean, I can't find it anywhere else. This idea that there's a couple things Marcion's really interesting about. So it's this idea that there's some God that's not connected to our universe at all. That's new. And then also, oh shoot, I've lost my thought.
Yeah, what are the Xenotheists? What some of his innovations that?
Yeah, his innovation. So, well, he also sees this God as a God of complete love and grace, which is also very interesting. I mean, he has no capricious characteristics at all. As you know, I mean, most gods in antiquity have capricious things about them, So that's interesting. The other thing is that he also detaches the God from any ethnic group or nation. So you see here something I think, again, really innovative.
Yeah, I mean, he was really. I mean, as I think Stephen Heller said, he was just a great logician. I mean,
Yeah.
he's the one who said, "We need a Bible." Nobody had thought of that in 150
Right.
years. Whoa.
Yes, I should say that too. I think that he did create the first New Testament, and I think he probably called it that as well. So I think that was his innovation, and I talk about why I think that in the book.
Yeah, so you would say Marcion really doesn't fall under, again, he's nowhere near Valentinus or the
No.
Sethians. He's kind of his own category for sure.
He's his own category. He would be what I would call a biblical theologian. He finds his theology by reading the Bible and interpreting it. Valentinus is more of a systematic theologian, where he wants kind of a philosophical system to explain everything, and then he'll read the Bible to kind of support that system. His system's very Egyptian, right? So it's both Middle Platonic and Egyptian. So he has all the hermaphrodite gods. He's got the Ogdoad. He's got basically the Atum or Amun. God is the primal father, the forefather, the snake that's in the water, and that stands up on the mound, or something like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, he's amazing, because when I read your book, it's like he leaves no stone unturned. I mean, he even talks about Jesus did not poop. He had the perfect body where nothing was wasted. If you drink water, it was digested. He was just, that's it. I mean, he covers all bases.
Yeah, and later we learned from later Catholics that Valentinus is attributed with the idea of the Trinity. Mm-hmm. He's the first one. He wrote a book on the Trinity. So I mean, the guy was, again, like Marcion, I think there was a lot of innovative thinking going on in Valentinus's work.
Very much, or his idea of, I even love the graph, because you talk about, well, how does he figure out Jesus, the Son, the human? And he's like, well, Sophia fell, and she remembered the Father in the pleroma, and she gave birth to the Aeon Christ. And the Aeon Christ is like, typical teenager. This place sucks. I'm going to the pleroma, better video games. And he leaves his poor mom, his teen mom. So then Sophia has like a shadow. The demiurge comes out. He creates the psychic Christ. And this very
Yeah.
cool family.
Yeah, very, very neat. And again, very much a systematic theologian. He wants to explain, the whole 9 yards. And interesting to me, he chooses to do so using mythological language rather than philosophical.
Exactly. Brilliant. Yeah, and the other, I think you touched upon this. Let me bring up the slide again, too, so we can better understand. Okay, I got this. Then we have, okay. They all have, you also talk about there's always a demiurgy, how they dealt with this creator intermediary God.
Right. Yeah, so in the book, what I suggest is that these Christian families were all using the same patterns, but they were kind of like mixing them up as you would in a jazz composition. And I think if you can think of early Christianity as a jazz composition, or early Christians as jazz composers, then you get it. So they're all sharing the Jewish scriptures, so they've got a lot of imagery and stuff from there. They're all sharing Middle Platonism, so there's always going to be materials from there they're going to be using as well. And they come up with these kind of patterns of the way that they think about things like Christology or demiurgy, a theology, and so forth, that then they kind of take bits and pieces and create systems with their own, like an individual Christian system. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, for example, the Sethians, their demiurgy, it would be villain, ignorant, impaired, right? But then
Yeah.
Marcion would say, well, justice too.
Right.
And so they're kind of taking characteristics based on the readings of the Hebrew Bible and Plato.
Exactly. Yep.
The other two is also, again, going against the grain of, the Catholic Church or the Greek Orthodox Church, of this like harmonious thing. You talk about how different religious movements emerge.
Right.
We have consolidated movement, reform movement, secessionist movement, innovative movement, chiastic movement, counter movement. That's how these Christian groups are starting to move as they evolve through the 2nd century.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for us to understand that each Christian movement has its own origin, right? Each movement has its own emergence. And we need to understand that, because then it will tell us who they're related to, or who they're responding to, or who they consider to be their kind of competitors, and so forth. And so I think this is a much easier way to think about the Apostolic Catholic Church, is really in response to Marcion begin consolidating churches. So Hegesippus is going around in the 160s to the different churches, and he's recording what ones are thinking like we do in Rome. What ones are in our network and saying these prayers. And by the way, here's our prayers. You guys should be saying these. He's writing this little kind of report about this. So there's some consolidation going on, and that's a really powerful social position to be from, to get a lot of churches that are already out there and operating to kind of come into your network, come in under your bishops, and toe the line. And so then a reformed movement, maybe it would be somebody like Valentinus, who starts out maybe wanting to reform what he sees going on in the Roman Church or Christianity at large. He wants it to be more of a grace-based religion. Doesn't happen, so he then becomes a secessionist movement where he leaves. He was never exiled. Nothing that ever says he was, but Tertullian says he chose to leave and start his own thing. So, yeah, and so forth.
Yeah, as you write, April, unlike Marcion, when talking about Valentinus, unlike Marcion, God had to be intuited and could not be known intellectual. So it's he's bringing, as you talk about in the Gnostic New Age, and you talk about in your book, comparing Christianities, that shamanistic quality that you had to experience the divine.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and I know that there's debate in among scholars about whether a Valentinus was Gnostic or not based on his letter fragments, but Tertullian tells us outright that that Valentinus taught the way through the spheres and up into the realms of the aeons. So I don't know. I mean, I guess we could say Tertullian didn't know what he was talking about, but I mean, I don't. It seems to be very interesting because the language, the terminology that Tertullian uses is quite different from what you know. I don't know what we might expect.
Yeah, and then there is a section in your book because again, it's got to be dealt with people wanting to get rid of the term Gnosticism, and you have a pretty long list
Yeah,
of groups that call themselves Gnostic: the
right.
Nassines, the Valentinians, the Sethians, Marcellina. I mean, on
Yeah.
and on. There were groups that were embracing this
And
idea of
you can
Gnostic.
see that it's a trans-confessional term that they're using, right? It's not, they don't mean like there's one Gnostic group somewhere. That's not what they're saying, right? They're using the word to mean something like we're the spiritual Christians. Our group is the real spiritual Christians because we have the real way to get back up into this transcendent realm. So, yeah.
Exactly. But then somebody like, I think Clement of Alexandria
Yeah.
would say Gnostic too, but well, he was kind of Gnostic. He had some, they
Yeah.
would turn into giant
He
angel.
created a Gnostic level for the Catholic Christians. It's like really interesting.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
cost him not being sainted.
Yeah.
Well, he's partially Platonist, right? Didn't
Oh,
he get a lot?
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, all those guys from Egypt, they were into some very cool vibes.
And I do talk quite a bit about both Clement and Origen in I think chapter 11 in the textbook as well. So yeah, that conversation's all there for you.
Yeah, you've got it. Yeah, again, you don't leave any of the great figures that became well, they were part of the creation of Christianity in that wild 2nd century and 3rd century too. Once you bring again Origen, Plotinus, all those guys,
Right.
they're all over the place. I think also moving to the 1st century, which I found fascinating, as you say, within the Jewish community, the sort of seeds of classical Gnosticism, you've got this fusion between the Ophites and the Barbelites. Could you tell the
Barbelites.
audience about that? Yeah, that's
Yeah. Yeah. So I've had to think a lot about the Sethian category. And I'm still not sure what I actually think about it.
it's a
But what I'm kind of moving toward is the idea that the Ophite myth was quite early. It was kind of a counter way to read the Genesis story. And became kind of popular and it went viral. I mean, people were referencing it and using it, and then they would develop kind of their own version of it, if you will, when they wrote down, whatever text they're working on or composing. And so the other mythology is the Barbelite mythology. That seems to be some kind of Egyptian mythology again that's developing, where the Ophite mythology seems to be really a rereading of the Genesis story, and trying to understand creation from that perspective. So you have, God, and then you have man, and then you have the Son of Man, and then you have the Son of Man. And it all comes from the way they're reading the Genesis story. Where the Barbelite mythology is more of a Egyptian mythology of a triad: the Father, the Mother, and the Son, and this sort of the way they auto-generate and so forth. And what some of the texts we call Sethian texts seem to be doing is axing the Ophite theology, and replacing it with the Barbelite theology, and then continuing along with the Genesis story, reading with the kind of Yahweh God being the bad dude and so forth. So that's what I can make of the situation.
For the audience, so the Ophite myth, it deals with the garden, and the snake is not the bad guy usually, and then it deals with the Son of Man.
Yeah, it has a different theology than the Barbelite, and it's a different theology actually from the Sethian text, most of them.
Right,
We see it prominently actually in Gnostic. You could check that text out if you're interested.
Gnosos the Blessed from the Nag Hammadi Library for you cats out there. You can access it at gnosis.org or get your copy. So what about I'm trying to remember, I think John Turner tried to make the case for the secret book of John. He said, Jesus is talking to the Apostle John, and he tells him the story, and it starts with the creation myth, like you said, the triad, the invisible spirit, and then suddenly you go into Genesis, and he said this was probably a fusion of the two theologies, right? I think he backtracked a little bit. I don't remember.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. I think it is a fusion, and probably whoever's making this fusion seems to be some kind of maybe Barbelite group that then is bringing in the Sethian the Ophite reading of the Genesis story, and they have particular rituals that they're practicing. The 5 seals, for instance. They have particular names of the baptizing angels. And I imagine that that's all coming from the Barbelite tradition.
And also your idea that we're moving down to the 4th century with the Platonizing Sethians, and scholars say, well, at some point,
3rd century?
Yeah, 3rd century start. Yeah. When they're dealing with Plotinus and fighting with them, arguing.
Right.
But it talks about, most scholars think, well, they were starting to get kicked out of churches, so Jesus is starting to be dropped, and they're becoming just sort of pagan or Neoplaton. But you think that another good theory is that they were already Platonists who just adopted some of the Barbelite theology.
Yeah. So if you go back and read Plotinus and what Porphyry tells us about the Christians who were in Plotinus's seminars, he understands them to be Platonists who are like heretical Platonists. They're not following Plato like they should, and he talks about them carrying around books with them. So they have some of the books that we have from Nag Hammadi that we typically would attribute to Sethians. And so scholars have said, oh, well, that must mean these guys are some kind of Sethians. But he also tells us that they had a book from someone that Tertullian tells us was a Valentinian. So they look to me like they're kind of philosophy type people. They're kind of esoteric Christians who are collecting esoteric materials, and then they're trying to create a new kind of philosophy, like a new Christian philosophy from it. So that's what I'm thinking right now, Miguel.
No, it makes perfect sense. It's just
that's consistent with the way people develop religions even in the modern time, right? All the different Christian sects and the different split offs and everything. I think you got something there.
Yeah. So I'm actually working on a manuscript, a book now called The Esoteric Jesus, and I want to look at how early Christianity formed within this space of esoteric thought. This is just something we have not looked at yet, and it really needs to be done. So, yeah.
For sure.
I mean, going all the way back to Paul, and he talks all about the hidden God, right? And then we get the Gospel of Mark, boom, bingo. I mean, we've got secrecy is like throughout Christian history, and the way these groups are using the secrets to kind of legitimize their new movement is super fascinating.
Yeah, I don't think people realize how, I don't want to say Gnostic the Gospel of Mark is, but you've got secret, special knowledge. You've got the devil ruling all the kingdoms. It's very initiatory in mystery religion and Gnostic, even from the get-go.
I don't know if I go that far, but there's something going on there, Miguel. And I think that whoever wrote this text, it wasn't called Mark. It was called the Gospel of Jesus Christ, which is a line from Paul's letters that Paul was revealed the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I think the author was attempting to write what he thought was the gospel revealed to Paul. So super fascinating.
Yeah. But again, a lot going on. And do you feel it's almost impressive that this small religion from, let's say, AD 30 or so to 150 was still kicking, right? Without
Yeah.
really any big money behind it, if you know what I mean. Big temples, emperors, here and there, but
no shekels.
And maybe that's one of the reasons why it was more successful, is it relied on the household. So in terms of conversion, when a person converted, the whole household converted, right? And so that's a way to get members.
yeah, and at the beginning, it was very open to women, slaves. The people like the cult of Dionysus. It was for the common folk, and they really grabbed onto it. So
right,
good stuff. And speaking of esoteric Jesus, because it's a way of how you approach Jesus, right? There's one way where we think, Jesus came so he would die for our sins or ransom our souls. But then there's the other Jesus where he's giving us special knowledge, right? Mark, the Gnostics.
Yeah.
He's giving us, and even some say, well, the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is there to give us this special information. But maybe upsetting some neo-Gnostics, you're pretty decisive, saying, well, the Gospel of Thomas is just not Gnostic.
Yeah, no, it comes from a Yahwist group, I think.
You think?
But that doesn't mean, however, Miguel, that a text can't become Gnostic in its use, right? Like if a person picks it up and wants to read it in that direction, they create a whole Gnostic imaginary based on it, then you have a neo-Gnostic moment, if you will. I mean, you have it. That's what happens. I mean, the same with any text from antiquity. I mean, Genesis isn't a Gnostic text, but it becomes a Gnostic text in the reading of it by particular people. So a lot of the work that I want to do as I move forward is thinking about how that happens. How is it that we, through interpretation, create a Gnostic imaginary, a brand new one? Right? And how does that spawn? This is what's happening in modernity.
Yeah.
Right. And so depending on what text you pick and how you read them, you create all different kinds of Gnostic imaginaries. And, some of them are ones that I would say are like full of light and good, and other ones can take kind of a dark turn.
Yeah. Right. Same as it ever. Yeah, like today, you've got people with like Jesus who's white and has a shotgun. And we can go back to the Nassenes. The preacher is changing like the Odyssey and Hermes to make him more like Jesus. Like, right. Well, that's Jesus.
Exactly.
So, or Addis is Jesus. It's like,
right.
Yeah, it's what we do. So don't worry, people, with the Gospel of Thomas. It may not mention Aeons or Sophia, but Syrian Christianity is pretty mystic anyway.
Yeah, it is. It is. And that's what I argue in my books on Thomas, is that we're dealing with a kind of almost a precursor to Eastern Orthodoxy there, where you have the mystical life being emphasized.
No, makes perfect sense. Well, for everybody who's joining us, April DeConick is here discussing comparing Christianities, a fascinating tour of how Christianity came about. Vince, any super chats you want to tackle or question?
Yes, we have some. First, Francis of Sophia Klatt said, speaking of Catholic versions of history, tradition holds that the Apostle Peter was the first pope, which I believe is not true. So who was the official first pope?
We have no idea. Sorry. When your records, the records weren't there. I mean, the early Catholics had to kind of construct that themselves. So who knows? And then, of course, they're choosing Peter because they understand their tradition to be apostolic. That is going back to the 12 apostles, not apostolic going back to Paul, but going back to the 12 apostles is how they originally kind of formed that whole idea. Yeah. And that idea is starting to form about 150.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you, well, who was living in the Vatican in the first century?
No, Vatican.
It was an Airbnb, Vance. They were renting it out at the time.
Oh boy. So moving on, Polaris 23 wanted to know if you could speak to the difference between Steiner, Rudolf Steiner's
Okay.
eighth sphere and the Gnostic Ogdoad.
Ogdoad.
Yeah.
I don't really think that I can make a comparison between those two. Steiner's really coming out of Theosophy and really coming out of Blavatsky's model. And she actually is relying on some Gnostic material. She reads Origen, so she knows some of that stuff. But it's like, we said earlier, these people are reading this material and they're taking what they want from it and they're remixing it into new systems. So, I don't do the perennial quest, like trying to find like what does reality really look like. I'm more interested in how different people create versions of reality that have meaning for them. Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
one that's fascinating, and I don't mind talking about, is I've been studying a lot with Elvis, and I found out that he actually went to Cielo Drive after the Sharon Tate murders because he had this thing about
Really?
he had this thing about death. He was life and birth and death. But so then I started restudying Charles Manson, and you start reading Charles Manson, and he's talking about Abraxas and the polarities, and we can leave and I'm like, man, he has sounded like a Gnostic. But what Charles Manson is doing is he's reading Hermann Hesse, who was very popular with the Beach Boys and in the 60s. Hermann Hesse was a patient of Carl Jung, and Carl Jung is rereading Basilides. So we go and so we have this new Gnostic religion in Charles Manson of all places.
And this is what I'm finding. And I call them alpha channels. These are people that wrote things that other people rely on to then create their own Gnostic imaginaries. And sometimes they're like Blavatsky, they're like Jung, as you said, Hess. I mean, these different folks become kind of like the main generators then of new Gnostic systems and ideas. We're really far removed from antiquity by this time, but nonetheless, you can really see how this thing transpires.
Right, so you have a lot of fun with that, with your students.
Yeah, and you have to be careful, and you have to like look through, can carefully kind of track what these folks were reading, what they knew about, in order that as they built their systems. And what's nice about modernity is we usually can do this, so that you're going to end up in the end with some kind of really big map, right? With all these like interchanges and, intersections. And it will be really fascinating when that project really gets fully underway.
It's like a collective mind, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where it's a collective thought process that goes over centuries.
Yeah. And I'm finding the more I kind of dig into this is that a lot of intellectuals in the 60s and 70s were heavily steeped in this material. Like they were reading the Nag Hammadi texts. They were taking college courses from famous professors. They were reading Jonas, really influenced by him. And a lot of these intellectuals, go on to become famous intellectuals themselves and really develop postmodern thought. And so I wonder how much of kind of the 60s counterculture and postmodern thought is actually developing out of these people's engagement with Gnostic materials.
100%.
It's something we have to explore.
Exactly. Well, I mean, right now you unfortunately have people on the right saying, communism, postmodernism comes out of Gnosticism, is just modern. And they're kind of right, but they're wrong. They're leaning too much on Eric Voegelin, who never read. So there needs to be some organizing that, you're right, but you're wrong.
Right. I'm with you, Miguel. I understand what you're saying. I've talked with my husband Wade about this a lot, and I'm like, god darn, they're right on that, but they're wrong. And I haven't quite been able to express it.
Yeah, indeed. Well, and
got another super chat.
Okay,
yes, there is. In fact, this one I can show because it came in the super chat. Are the Barbelites the same as the Borderites? And if so, have Epiphanius's accusative descriptions of their more extreme and vile rituals also been reported by others?
No, they're not the same. They're a different. They're something different. We do hear about these rituals in Pissa Sophia. So they are reported by other people. I do have a discussion of this. Let's see, where do I have that? Is it in Gnostic New Age? I think it may be. And I also have a discussion of it in my book, Holy Misogyny. So I would just point you there for, if you want additional information, either one of those sources.
Okay. I had a question for you, which was Josephus, who was before 150 AD. What's your take on that? I know, people have alleged that people added to Josephus's writings, but what's your take on his reflections on and connections with ancient Christianity?
So, so if he did, if we were to say yes, the passages where he talks about the followers of Christ actually come from him, we don't get a whole lot of information.
Yeah,
so
for the audience,
he compares him to John the Baptist. There's not a whole lot there.
Yeah, it's too bad, huh?
Yeah.
And for the audience, Asterox, in our last interview or the one before, April does contend that the Gnostics were practicing some sort of sex magic. It came from the Egyptian matrix. John Turner told me in private that he believed, he had no doubt, but he couldn't make a scholarly argument. But if he had to bet money or bet a cigarette knowing him or a joint.
And again, Miguel, it's not all the different Gnostic groups. It's some Gnostic group. And like Pista Sophia, those Gnostics, they actually don't like the practice. So they criticize the practice. So they know about it. They know people are doing it. They criticize it. So again, differing opinions on these practices. But again, the idea was that the sperm, if you will, contains the soul, and that's being, that's going to make the new baby, right? And so if I can have a ritual where I can collect that and do something to like make it ascend up into the realms where we want it to go, then that's what I should be doing. And so that's kind of the basis of that practice, I think.
Yeah, and there's always reforms. Remember what the cult of Dionysus was once women partying, sex, and then it got reformed. They invited men. They stopped eating meat. We're going to hang out in the forest, but we're going to no sex, just kind of pray to the, there's always a reform here and there. Sometimes more radical than others. I think another one that I wanted to bring up, which I found fascinating, is, again, we're talking about Jung and Hesse and Charles Manson is Basilides himself. Let's talk to Basilides. But you talked that his great innovation might have been the idea of creation from nothing, ex nihilo or whatever. Could you tell the audience about that one?
Yeah, he's talking about it. This becomes a major doctrine of almost all the early Christians. I don't know where he got it from. Did he pick it up from another Christian earlier on, or is this something that, he worked out himself? But it's a major part of his system. Absolutely. His system depends on this idea. That's why I think he might have been the one to innovate it.
And how, I guess, thinking about it, and for the audience, as before it was assumed there was chaos, there was some form, and the gods would just, they would just shape it. Even Yahweh.
Even in Genesis story, there's water, there's darkness, there's something that's being worked on by the God, right? There's primal stuff. Egyptians were like, there's invisibility, there's darkness. So Basilides says there is nothing. There's absolutely nothing. And that nothing is sort of like a vacuum. That's how I think of it in my mind, that will generate something as it kind of sucks stuff in. Or like it's a vacuum that has that movement, right? So it's really interesting. I learned a lot when I wrote that chapter. I didn't know a whole lot about Basilides prior to writing, other than, you know, like what you read in Irenaeus or something. And I really buckled down on him because I realized that, like Valentinus, he was a systematic theologian and he wanted everything to make sense. And so his system is even more complicated than Valentinus's system, and very philosophical. He seems to me to know a lot about Stoicism. He's arguing with the Stoics, and he is making some pretty good arguments against them.
Yeah, I love how you talk about, he's talking about how we all have sin nature, like this karma, so we'll keep reincarnating because of karma. But then somebody, well, what about Jesus? It's like, well, Jesus he has the potential of sin nature, so he can suffer, but he doesn't sin. It's very smart. He's very smart.
No, it's beautiful. Really. I mean, a lot of what he said,
And he comes up with something I'd never heard of, because studying Gnosticism all these years, I'm pretty much, I toe the party line, you know, Hylic, psychic, pneumatic, Hylic, psychic,
he's got
pneumatic.
something else.
And he's like, whoa, dude, you're introducing something else. Don't do this to me. Philia substance. What is this, April?
I think he didn't like the Valentinians. So he said, we're better than you guys because we got like God substance. Like, he wanted to distinguish pneuma, which the Valentinians they were arguing that was God substance, right? He wanted to argue that no, that's not yet quite God substance, that there's a fourth thing, and that's filio, or kinship substance. So it's birth from God himself. So it's not from Sophia, this lesser aeon, but it's birth from God himself.
Ooh, the God is love theory.
Yeah.
And how do we get some of this philia stuff, us little humans down here, April? How would
you either have it or you don't. You can't get it. You're either born with it or not, Miguel.
Predestination. Good old Basilides.
Yeah.
And you talk about Basilides being with the Stoics, but at the same time, I like how you talk Carpocrates and his son. They were more towards the cynics. They were like what I would like to call Gnostics, anarchists without archons, but they were definitely anarchists, right? They were.
I don't know if they were anarchists, but they definitely have this model of, I think, wanting to like be more like mimicking the natural order, which they felt that the creator God had kind of imposed this natural order from what he saw the kind of perfect order being. Yeah.
And that's what corrupts things and brings reincarnation and suffering, is the law. It puts this pressure on our natural self, and we find ourselves reincarnating, sinning, just trapped.
Yep. So again, a reader of Paul, but I think through a cynic lens rather than a Stoic or a Middle Platonic lens. Although, I mean, he also had some Middle Platonism too. I mean, they all do, but.
Indeed. So fascinating. And for the audience, again, definitely get Comparing Christianities, as we were talking before the interview. Sometimes we'll have a scholar, like we had Arthur Virtual and his book, American Gnosis, great book. And of course, people are emailing, it's $120. It's like, scholarly books. But your book, thank God, is very affordable, and people will get so much use out of it.
Yeah, I think it's like, what, $30 or $40?
Something like that. And then the Kindle's like even cheaper.
Yeah.
So, and you'll have all the graphs on Gnostics who call themselves Gnostics, the demiurgy, the different minimalists. It's all set out because, like you said, you wrote this for students, right?
I did.
Young people who wanted to understand early Christianity.
I did. Yes, that is why I wrote it. When I was a young person, about 18, and first came across these materials, actually through the Gospel of Thomas. In the 80s, there was very little that I could access as a public person, not, I wasn't a scholar. I mean, I was just a kid. And I realized at the time that such a such an introduction didn't exist. I couldn't, like, what was I supposed to do? So I started just taking classes at university to try to learn, and that kind of charted my trajectory. And so I wanted to, as part of my own career, I wanted to write that book I wish I had when I was 18.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And but I remember your story. What the Gospel of Thomas really moved you. Speaking of,
it did really move me. I read it and I was like, wow. I mean, this was a Jesus that I really aligned with, if you will. He seemed quite different from the Gospels Jesus that I was used to in church, and so I was sort of riveted by the whole question about why hadn't I heard of this text before? What was it? If it was some early text, why wasn't in the canon? And I had all those questions that everybody has when they first encounter that kind of material.
Very much so. And of course, the same questions we always have. Why is the God of the Hebrew Bible different than Jesus? We all have these secret questions growing up, and suddenly the Gnostics kind of answer these questions. And Marcion, of course,
Yeah.
the story of the 42 bears murdering those poor kids because they made fun of bald Elijah. Stories like that. All right. Well, we are getting towards the end. Any last questions that you might have, Vance, or the audience, before we move on to the philia substance?
Oh yeah, I did have one, which is the Jesuits. What do you think about the Jesuits, within the Catholic Church? And because I have this thing called a book called the Dictionary of the Bible, which was written by them, and they actually tell you about the Elohist and the Yahwist sections of Genesis.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah. So those references are not what I'm talking about at all. Those are a kind of names that scholars have given to the different authors that they think wrote the materials that end up in the Hebrew Bible. So they talk about an Elohist source, meaning that particular source of when it talks about God uses the term Elohim.
Yeah.
Or the Yahwist source is a particular source that their stories always talk about the God as Yahweh. And these sources were brought together by an editor, and the Hebrew Bible was formed, and other sources, but that's the general gist of that. That's not what I'm talking about at all.
Do you think that they had a suspicion that they were, the El was, the higher God and the Yahweh was the lower God?
I don't think so, no.
Oh.
I think what you have is some tribal god by the name of El Shaddai, and being blended with another sort of tribe god, Yahweh, the god of birth or birthing or something like that. And they're coming together in the stories.
I ask because the Genesis 1 seems like such a benevolent God. He just creates and it's good, and that'd be more consistent with the God above God. And then the Yahweh, he right away starts, in my opinion, lying and trying to keep Adam and Eve from ascending and knowing they are being as gods.
Vance, you're right that the Christians who were reading those texts certainly were noticing those differences, and then they would use those differences then to create some kind of Gnostic a retelling of the story.
Yeah, that was my introduction to Gnosticism.
Or the myth of Lilith, or a lot of fun stuff they gave us.
Yeah.
So it's nothing secret. I mean, April, I went to St. Thomas up the road from you, and the Basilian priest had no problem when we'd have to take introductory New Testament classes, like, well, who was this Holy Spirit? And the priest would be, oh, that's a thing in classical times, gods having sex with women and creating they were, what I mean? Scholarship was scholarship. People in my class were like, but
I'm old enough we had the Holy Ghost. Oh man, I was scared of the Holy Ghost. You come and haunt me at night.
Oh, that's good.
Well, awesome. Well, we are at the end of this fascinating conversation. Definitely get Comparing Christianities. You will not regret it, and you will enjoy it for the rest of your life. But Vance, thanks for keeping us company and keeping track of the Chitico.
Oh, my pleasure. And, April, I'm so happy to have you here
Thanks,
today.
Vance,
It
and
was
thanks, Miguel,
delightful.
and everybody
And
else in the chat.
educational.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for your support, super chats, great conversation. And April, is always great to have you on, and good luck with the book and
Thank you.
the rest of your research.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your Friday and your weekend. Take care, everybody, and we will be talking soon.
Take care.